Let me repeat very briefly what I said yesterday so that you may remember your questions. I keep repeating, if you have any questions yourself, go back to the basics, and almost certainly those questions will disappear. What are the basics? The basics are extremely simple. All there is consciousness. But consciousness has aspects. Consciousness can be at rest. Primal energy, potential energy, same thing. The scientists would prefer it to be called potential energy, or consciousness, or the source from which everything has come, the one without the second. So all there really is and always has been and always will be is the source, the one without the second. That is the primary concept. Having got it, we can forget about it. We can forget about it for this reason. As far as we are concerned, consciousness is in movement. Manifestation has arisen from the source. If the manifestation has arisen from the source, and the source has always been all there is, then obviously the source has not used any material outside of itself to produce the manifestation. So the source has produced the manifestation from within itself. And a beautiful example is given in the Hindu scriptures, and that is, he says the manifestation, the source produces the manifestation like the spider produces the web without any materials from outside of itself. The spider produces the web from itself, and when it takes back into itself. That's an amazingly good simile. So consciousness at rest becomes consciousness in movement and produces the manifestation as its own expression or as its own appearance. Or you can say potential energy activizes itself. That is a better concept, because the question mind asks, how does the manifestation arise? Why does the manifestation arise? Why does the manifestation arise? Because it is the nature of the potential to activize itself sometime. If the potential did not activize itself sometime, it wouldn't be potential. It would be dead matter. So it is the nature of the potential to activize itself sometime. And it activizes itself with an enormous, incredible, unimaginable amount of energy. What is generally known as the Big Bang. And when the tremendous energy produced by the Big Bang exhausts itself sometime, millions and millions of years later, the manifestation goes back into the potential. Until again, because it is the nature of the potential, activization happens again. So having used that concept, I keep saying, forget the source at rest. We are concerned with the consciousness in movement, manifestation. The functioning of manifestation is the life as we know it. So all our questions would be based on life as we know it, including the question of self-realization or enlightenment. So the question of enlightenment or self-realization only the individual human being is concerned. The animal is not concerned. It is the human being who is concerned with enlightenment or self-realization. Why is that? The seeking, therefore, according to my concept, which is the basic concept, the basic concept in life as we know it. As I said, having accepted that the consciousness in movement, the manifestation, is an expression of the consciousness at rest or potential energy, we better forget it. Because it's the same consciousness, it is the same energy. So the question now is, in life as we know it, what is my basic concept? In life as we know it, my basic concept is extraordinarily simple. The 4 words in the Bible. Thy will be done. Same thing in every religion. Same basic concept in every religion. And yet we have religious wars. Why? Because the basic concept is forgotten. And interpreters have interpreted, given their own interpretation to each religion. And the interpretations are concepts. And concepts are something which some people can accept, some people cannot accept. So concepts of one religion are not acceptable to concepts of another religion. Concepts of one sect in a religion are not acceptable to another sect in the same religion. So we have wars. So we have a war in Ireland, same Christian religion. So basically, concepts are not acceptable to one another because a concept is not the truth. So as I said yesterday, there is only one truth. Anything that any sage has said at any time, this becomes part of my basic concept. Anything any sage has said at any time, anything any scripture of any religion has said at any time is a concept. A concept being something which some people may accept, some people may not be able to accept, may want to accept but are not able to accept. So, the truth is only that which no one can deny. And I am speaking from the point of view, not consciousness at rest, we forget about it, but consciousness in movement, which is manifestation and its functioning, which is life as we know it. So, in life as we know it, is there any truth at all? Or is everything a concept? The answer is, there is a truth in life as we know it. And that is which no one can deny. An atheist may come to me and say, look, I've studied this subject for many years. I have a doctorate in comparative religions. And I am of the absolutely firm view that God does not exist. He is entitled to it because God is a concept. So my question to the atheist would be, God may or may not exist. But do you deny that you exist? Which the atheist cannot deny. And which no one can deny. That he exists. I am. I exist. And that I am, which no one can deny, is not a personal awareness of existing, Otherwise, it would be different. And yet, each person says, I am, I exist. Therefore, that I am, which every person says, cannot be an individual awareness of existence, but necessarily has to be a universal or impersonal awareness of existence. That is the truth. I am. And every religion says the same thing. The truth is hidden or veiled by ignorance. What is the ignorance? The ignorance is that impersonal awareness of I am is covered or hidden by the personal awareness. I'm John, I'm Jane, I'm Michael, I'm Heiner, I'm Margaret. So, I am is the truth, I am John is ignorance. And it is this ignorance which causes one an enormous amount of pain. The amount of guilt an average person carries is truly enormous, with or without realizing it, only because of the ignorance. The ignorance being, I am a separate being. I exist separately. I do things. I am the creator of my actions. I am responsible for my actions. Deep down, from his own personal experience, every person knows it, that he is really not in control of his life. He decides to do one thing, something else happens. That's been life as we know it. And yet, deep down, he cannot forget the fact that he is a separate individual, in control of his life, responsible for his actions, which is generally what is known as the ego. The ego, from personal experience, knows generally that he or she is not in charge of his or her life. And yet he cannot get rid of the fact that he is in charge, he is in control, he is the doer. He or she is the doer. Now why is that? In other words, why has the ego come into existence, bringing with it a little happiness and a great deal of unhappiness? Obviously, where did the ego come from? Obviously, again, where could the ego have come from except from the source? Where could the ego have come from except from the source? In other words, the source has created the ignorance. The source has created the ego. The source has created the source of unhappiness. So why has the source created the ego? The source has created the ego out of what I call divine hypnosis. The ego knows from personal experience that he is truly not in control, and yet he finds it impossible to give up the idea that he is not the doer, that he is not the doer. He thinks he is the doer. So this is the hypnosis. It is the divine hypnosis by which the source has created the ego. And whether you call the source, or primal energy, or potential energy, or consciousness, or awareness, or simply God makes no difference, so long it is never forgotten that all these words, including God, refers to the source. The word God can create a certain misunderstanding, because God is generally understood as an entity concerned with the manifestation, all powerful, all knowing, all merciful. Nonetheless, an entity connected with the manifestation, an entity which came into existence only with the manifestation. That is not my meaning of the word God when I keep using God. But God is used in the sense of the source. And when that is understood, the question, why did God create disease and wars, will not arise. The question arises, why did God create disabled children, handicapped children? Why did God create disease? The question arises because that mind intellect which has created the God, the concept of God, has given it attributes. The same intellect which has created the concept of God says God is all powerful, God is all knowing, God is all merciful. God never told anybody He is merciful. You say, God, you are merciful, and then you ask Him, God, why did you create disease and handicapped children? So if we understand by the word God the source, then it is easy to understand that in the manifestation and its functioning is based on duality. Duality means opposites. And opposites mean health and disease, war and peace, male and female, without which the manifestation and its functioning cannot happen. So the manifestation and its functioning is based on duality, opposites. And in the opposites, human relationships have to happen. For life as we know it to happen, interhuman relationships between individuals who consider themselves each an individual entity, there are interhuman relationships. Friendship and enmity, love and hate, without which life as we know it wouldn't exist. So for interhuman relationships to exist, for life as we know it to exist, the source had to create egos. So the source created the egos. And the ego says, I am seeking enlightenment. So my basic concept is, the ego is a mere divine hypnosis, a creation of the hypnosis, a fiction, created so that life as we know it could happen. So my basic concept is, one of my basic concepts is, that God simply had to create egos for life as we know it to happen, for the Hindu Leela to happen, the game of God to happen, the functioning of manifestation to happen. And when God created the egos in every human body, mind, organism, the same source also started the process of demolishing the ego in a certain limited number of cases. I mean, there was no sense in God creating the egos and destroying all of them. That even an idiot wouldn't do. So, what God did start as part of life, mind you, I keep saying, as part of life as we know it. What God did create is the egos in every human being, human body, mind, organism, and at the same time started the process of destroying the egos in a limited number of cases. There is a verse in the Bhagavad Gita where Lord Krishna says, out of thousands of people, there is only one seeker, spiritual seeker. And out of the thousands of seekers, hardly one knows me in principle. I repeat, out of thousands people, there is one seeker. And out of thousands of seekers, hardly one knows me in principle. My interpretation, my conceptual interpretation, let me make it perfectly clear, is very simple. My conceptual interpretation of this is that the thousands of seekers who are again created by the ego, by the source. How does the source create a seeker? Out of thousands of people, there is a seeker. How does that happen? That happens because the seeker, in creating the human being, has created the human being, again my concept, as a uniquely programmed instrument or computer, through which he can produce such actions or deeds as he wants. And that individual, unique human instrument or computer, some limited number of these human programmed computers have been so programmed by the source that this kind of seeking can happen. So the seekers happen because the source has created certain body-mind organisms with such a unique programming that this kind of seeking will happen. In other words, basically what I am saying is, there never has been a seeker. There never has been a seeker after enlightenment. There never has been a seeker after money. There never has been a seeker after fame. There never has been a seeker after power. What has been happening actually as part of life, as part of the functioning of manifestation, is that seeking of various kinds have been happening. The whole movie is already there. The whole movie is already there. And according to my concept, the script has been, the consciousness of the source or God has written the script, has produced and directed the movie, is playing all the characters in the movie, and it is the source or consciousness of God who is witnessing the movie. It is all there. And the same thing, curiously, has been said in the Bhagavad Gita, where Lord Krishna tells Arjuna, you think you are going to kill who are supposed to be your enemies, your friends and relatives, even your preceptors. That is why you don't want to fight. But he says, as time, I have already killed them. you will only be the apparent instrument for their death. Because the destiny is that they will be killed through a body-mind organism called Arjuna. I have already killed them. So whatever is going to happen in the future, in the movie, is already there. That is my concept.
There is an instrument being used.
So, which instrument will be used by the source for what purpose? Only he knows. He used a body-mind organism called Albert Einstein for the theory of relativity. He used the instrument called Hitler to destroy millions of Jews. He used a body-mind organism called Jesus Christ for that particular purpose. He used a body-mind organism called Mother Teresa for the work that was done. And he is also using certain number of psychopathic organisms to do whatever the psychopathic organisms are destined to do.
Time. Yes, we imagine that time is that we imagine that the now is a moment. No one knows quite how long the moment called now lasts, but we normally think of now as a moment, and that before the moment there is a vast space, or behind the present moment there is this vast space which we call the past. And in front of the present moment there is this vast space which we call the future. And we believe that the now is moving slowly along from the past to the future. But what's very interesting is to actually try to, not just to think about the past or the future, but to actually experience it. Because experience must be the test of reality. So for instance now, if I were to ask you to think about or imagine breakfast this morning, you'd find it quite easy. So that thought or image appears now. So the thought or the image of time is not itself an experience of time. In order to experience time, we have to step out of the now and actually visit the place we call the past, or the place we call the future. Now, try now to do that. See if you can just for a few seconds step out of the now and visit the past. Actually experience the past, not think about it, but experience it.
Before this retreat, Rupert, I would have told you I can, because I felt feelings in my body that would prove to me that I'm feeling the past now, that the past is here. But now that I'm understanding experiencing more as opposed to things being actual entities or real objects, I would have to say no. There's no possibility that I can enter the past.
Yes, no one has ever been there. No one has ever stepped out of the now and visited either of these two spaces called the past or the future. The memory of breakfast this morning doesn't prove time. But the finite mind cannot understand that. Let me try to give you an illustration. Take a novel. Imagine a novel, and the novel is the story of a person's life. As a woman is born, she lives to 100 years old, and the novel is the story of her life that takes place in over 100 years. Now, the entire contents of the novel is present simultaneously. However, the mind can only access the novel page by page. So the mind superimposes its own limitations on the novel and makes it seem as if the story of the woman's life appears in time. No, the story of the woman's life is present now. The entire story is present now. But the limitations of the mind make the eternal now look like time. In other words, we could formulate that by saying that time is eternity filtered through the limitations of mind. And in fact, another illustration of this is what takes place in dreams every night. When the dreamer falls asleep at night, she dreams that she enters her own imagination. We discussed this yesterday. She enters her own imagination and dreams that she is a person in her dream, from whose point of view she knows the dreamed world. Now, from the point of view of the person in the dream, the subject of experience, who knows the dreamed world, her experience seems to take place in time and space. And the dream, she can spend 30 years in the dream, traveling all around the world. And the person in the dream, from whose point of view the dreamed world is known, believes and feels my experience takes place in time. Now, when the dreamer wakes up, she realizes that the dream didn't take any time or space in her mind. So it was the dreamer's mind, the dream took place in a moment in the dreamer's mind. It took up no space in the dreamer's mind. But when the dreamer's mind was filtered through the separate subject of experience in the dream, what is eternity, or just a moment now for the dreamer, appears as time for the dreamed character.
And who is it who starts to know that we're dreaming and unmix the consciousness?
Well, the only one that knows anything. Let's, just for ease of conversation, let's call the person who falls asleep at night Mary. Mary has a dream, and she dreams that she's Jane on a Caribbean beach, just to make the conversation easier. So, if we ask, your question is, when Jane is experiencing her holiday on the Caribbean beach, who is it that really has that experience? In other words, who is Jane really? Jane believes that she knows her experience with a consciousness that lives just behind her eyes. And this seems very obvious to her. She closes her eyes and the Caribbean beach disappears. She opens her eyes again and the Caribbean beach reappears. So she reasonably concludes from this, whatever it is that is seeing or knowing the Caribbean beach must live just behind my eyes, because when I close them, the beach disappears. When I open them, the beach appears. So from Jane's point of view, the character in the dream, she concludes, and everybody else, all her friends conclude the same thing, that that which knows her experience lives in and is indeed a byproduct of her body. And therefore she feels that what she essentially is shares the limits and therefore the destiny of her body. But with what does Jane know her experience? Whose mind really knows Jane's experience?
Mary.
Mary. Because Mary is the only mind there is.
Yeah.
There is no such mind or person called Jane. Jane is just a temporary limitation of Mary's mind. It's only from Jane's point of view that she feels, I am a separate, independently existing self. But the only self, if we can call it a self, the only one that is truly there is not in Jane's body, or indeed to be found in Jane's world. It is Mary's infinite mind.
So when Jane...
And we are all Janes.
We're all Janes.
We are all Janes.
Yeah. When Jane begins to ask the question, or to, what am I, or to self-inquire.
Yes.
And Jane is actually asking Mary, who am I?
Yes. Yes. What happens when Jane asks herself the question, who am I really? What is the nature of the knowing with which I know my experience? And she begins the tracing back of her experience that we referred to earlier. And at some point, there is this recognition, I am Mary. Now, who has the experience, I am Mary? Does Jane have it?
Mary does.
No, of course, Mary has it, because Mary is the only one there to have it. So Jane never recognizes her true nature, because Jane is simply a limitation of Mary's. Yes. And this is why it says that the Balayani, the Sufi mystic, that these these exquisite words. He says, I knew my Lord through my Lord. This is what he means.
Mm-hmm.
And on another occasion he said, no one sees him except himself. No one approaches him except himself. No one knows him except himself. Only he knows him. He knows himself by himself. He sees himself by means of himself alone. Only he knows him. These beautiful lines that express that infinite consciousness can only be known by infinite consciousness. Mm. Jane cannot know Mary because there is no Jane. Now, there is no such thing as three separate individual people sitting here. The essence of each of our minds is the same infinite, indivisible consciousness, or in religious language, God's infinite being. Mm. And that is why when each of us, the knowledge that each of us have, the simple knowledge I am, that is God's being shining in each of our minds. So the knowledge I am is like a portal through which the finite mind passes on its way back to its essence. And that is why it says that is why it was carved on the temple of Apollo at Delphi, know thyself. Mm. Know what is meant by the word I. Mm. So the I is like the I is the highest mantra, the divine name that gives the mind a hint as to where to find its essence.
Mm. Beautiful.
There was no energy left in me to fight it. And at that point, this incredible, profound sense of peace overcame me. Somehow I had this sense that I was going to be okay. No harm was going to come to me. Distinctly a feeling that I was loved, which begged the question, by whom? And at that point in my life, I was a profound agnostic. I just couldn't tell you if there was a God or not. As far as I was concerned, I didn't have enough information. So it wasn't like I carried with me this belief in God, that God was going to make everything okay. Which makes it all the more interesting that I had this sense of profound peace and the feeling of being loved, because it begged the question, by whom? Well, I knew I was leaving the earth, and just as if I were to say to you, picture yourself on a lake, you would draw a mental image in your mind of being on a lake. You're not physically there, you don't see it, but we tend to operate this way. We use words and then we draw pictures in our minds. If I say the word tree to you, you bring to mind a picture of a tree, and that tree is probably one of, or a composite of, every tree you've ever seen. Well, just like that, I pictured myself leaving the earth, and I pictured myself out in space looking at the earth from not a considerable distance, but, you know, there's the earth right in front of me. And what was so strange about looking at the earth like that was that at that moment, you could have asked me any given moment in my life, because I just relived it, but you could have asked me any given moment in any person's life on that planet, and I could have told you. All of that information was right there. It was available. Not just any person living there now, any person that had ever lived there or ever would live there. All that information is all available. It's right there. And what kept going through my mind at this point was, oh, of course. I was, if you will, remembering what I had forgotten very intentionally in order to be on this planet, which is what we all do. In point of fact, I don't think that this planet exists. It's a figment of our imagination, if you will, and we have a very good imagination. We're incredibly creative beings. But whether or not it's for real doesn't really matter. The truth of the matter is that we know things when we're not here that we choose to forget while we are here. I make the analogy because I think it works so well. It's like when you're sitting in a chair reading a book that's a really good book that you're really involved in. Somebody could walk in the room and talk to you and you don't know they're there. Your focus of attention is not on the book, the story in the book. And you can get so preoccupied with that, you lose track of everything around you. You just tune all of that out and you focus on one thing. Similarly, you know everything about what your life's going to be like here. From beginning to end, you knew it before you got here, and you will know it again when you leave here. But while you're here, you're focused on it. And you're focused on each given moment in it. And when you leave here, it all comes rushing back and you say, of course, yes. That, and it's all so simple. It's very simple. What is your life like when you're not here? If you try to define it, you run into problems because it is so simple that it's best described in English as this. You are. Stop. The minute you say anything other than that, you're talking about something earthly. We don't have English for other things. And probably more important, everything there is simpler than what it is here, not more complicated. At that moment, I no longer had any awareness of any of my senses. I didn't have a body. I didn't see anything. I could picture the earth in my mind, but I didn't see the earth. I didn't see blackness. That's seeing something. I saw nothing. There was no sight. There was no touch. There was no taste. There was no smell. There was no feel. Didn't have any of those senses at all. And yet, my brain was functioning, my mind was functioning. That which occupies my brain was functioning. And certainly you could still think in English, although English became quite irrelevant at that point because it didn't describe anything of what was going on. And of course, foremost on your mind is that all of your senses have just been cut off. Well, not quite all of your senses. Your sixth sense is still working very well. I say still working because your sixth sense is working while you're here. It's one of the things that you choose to ignore to be here. You choose to because it makes the experience of being here have more depth, more intensity, if you will. It takes on a more realistic look to it. If your psychic sense is working, if you're still picking up on what everyone else is thinking, including yourself, and what goes on outside this planet, you're not as focused on the book. So people have often asked me, how do you become psychic? And I just have to laugh. No, you don't become psychic. You are psychic. You forget that you're psychic. You let go of your senses here and your sixth sense is still right there and you have got it at all times. And it is not something that you do. It's that you stop doing this. So people look to try to figure things out psychically and they think there's some effort you have to make. No, you stop making an effort. It's the exact opposite of what you would expect. You stop thinking about focusing here. You stop thinking about your sensory input here. You stop thinking about a whole frame of reference of being here. Meditation is wonderful for this. It centers you, if you will, in source. You let go. Basically, people, when they tell you to meditate, they'll say, you just sit in one place, close your eyes, try and just ignore all sensory input and say, I am. Excellent. That is source. Very definitely. And don't be too terribly disappointed if you find that you cannot turn on the psychic charms and become the world's renowned psychic overnight, because you lose a lot of depth of what's going on here if you choose to do that. For the moment, back to where I was. I'm out in space and I'm looking at the Earth and I'm knowing what's going on with everybody's life in it. And then, because everybody has always told me, and I'm still somewhat referencing things, of course, but in earthly terms, I'm looking at it and saying, well, I guess it's time for me to move on and go to the other place. So in my mind, I pictured turning away from the Earth and going out into space. In point of fact, I did not go anywhere. I was not in a space. I was not out in space. I did not head for some planet. That's the way I pictured it in my mind, because all of a sudden all your senses are cut off and you feel very disoriented, so you try to reference things in a way that you're accustomed to. And of course you're wondering, where am I going next? I don't have a direction. I don't know that I'm in space. I don't know where I would travel to if I was. So where is it I'm going? And at this point, the expression, the white light in the tunnel, plays in. Now, mind you, you don't have any senses. You don't see anything. You don't hear anything. You don't smell anything. You don't have any space and time. Nothing exists as far as that goes. For you to go through a tunnel is patently absurd. But how else do you describe what is a psychological tunnel? Very definitely. Because all of your inputs just gotten cut off. Not all of it. I sensed that I was loved. I sensed that I would be fine. Where is that coming from, and how do I go to that? And of course, when you first start thinking about that, it's an idea. It's a feeling and an idea that has no space and time, no location, but you want to go to it. Well, initially, that's a very small thing, if you will. And yet, as you try to turn your focus on it, and I don't mean your visual focus, but you focus your mind on that and wanting to go there, it becomes bigger. And so it's as if it is a little ray of light off in the distance with dark all around it, which could easily be described as a tunnel. But it is a psychological tunnel. And it is a tunnel. Your input just all got cut off except one little bit of input. And it's very profound, but it's relatively small. It somehow seems distant, although it seems to be getting closer. Because with all your other input cut off, you focus on it more. It's the only thing you have left to focus upon. And so you, if you will, move through the tunnel and towards the light. And I won't say that you're greeted there by some people who walk up and, how you doing, Fred, and shake your hand. No. There's no bodies there. There can be. You can picture them that way. You pictured them here, and you can picture them there if you want to. This gets really confusing, because we are creating our reality here on this planet. Every last bit of it, we're creating it in our mind. Our images that we create are all our images, and science is starting to bear this out. If you've seen the movie What the Bleep, the quantum physicist will tell you, you look at water and you change its molecular structure. Without someone looking at it, we don't know what it would be, because how do you do that? Very difficult. But you're creating your reality here. If I was going to try to describe what I believe we are at our source, what we are like, we are extremely creative beings. We can sit and do absolutely nothing and be as little as possible if we want to, but it just doesn't seem to be in our nature. We like to create things. And if you made the analogy that your life was like a movie that you made, where you picked all of the characters and the actors to play in your movie, and you wrote the script out and said, this is what I want to have happen and how I want it to be, that would be a very good analogy. And that's where it gets really interesting, because from this perspective, we're very much used to the idea of looking at things and judging things. I like that. I don't like that. Well, so we say this is good and we say this is bad. And we, of course, assume that there is a universal good and bad out there. I agree there's a universal good and bad out there, but here's the strange twist to it, is that the universal part of it is the fact that good is what you like and bad is what you don't like, and it's different for everybody. And that's where life gets really strange, because people then say, well, but there's no universal good or evil. No, there isn't. Well, what about the guy who kills people? Well, what would you tell me about the actor in the movie who plays the serial killer and goes through the movie killing a series of people? Is he a bad person? No, you have judged the character that he plays as a bad person. Did anybody really die? No. You got caught up in the story and decided to believe that killing people was bad to experience the drama of the whole thing. Well, what about good and bad? There aren't any. That sounds kind of harsh and really twisted from what most people think, because we're all pretty much brought up to believe that there are good things and bad things in life. Well, that's true from any given perspective, but not universally. If this is all a stage play and none of it's real, none of it truly exists except in our minds, and we are all co-authoring each other's plays as well as our own, and getting together and putting this play together, then what happens here is all an experiment in what it's like to focus on a given set of circumstances of our own making, and it's okay. Doesn't make any difference how it turns out, doesn't make any difference what you do. You came here to experience those things. Well, it has the distinct disadvantage that you don't get to blame everything that's gone wrong in your life on God or the devil or whoever it is you want to try to put in that little slot, if in point of fact you're the author of it all and that you agreed to it all long before you came here. It has the distinct advantage that you can never be a victim unless you chose to be one. And even then, you aren't truly a victim. You're experiencing what it feels like to be one, but you aren't. This has got a real distinct advantage to it if you think about it, because you have nothing to fear. Which is a lot better way to live your life than running around scared all the time that you could become a victim. There are things out there that could happen to you that are beyond your control. Well, in the first place, what I experience tells me that that's not the case. But just as a practical matter here, we both hope that that's not the case, because if it is, you could be a victim. And in my world, I can't be. Which world would you rather live in? As a practical matter, I'd rather live in my world. Now, these things were obvious to me when I was there. No, I didn't get met at the pearly gates. No, I wasn't in heaven. No, I wasn't in hell. No, I wasn't in purgatory. I was in a wonderful place. I felt completely loved. I was in touch with a vast array of other beings. I was part of it. They were part of me. We're all one. If I was going to try to address the question of whether or not there is a God, I would say to you that if there is a God, first off, what you're doing in your playtime on this playground, he doesn't care about any more than your mom worries about what it is you're doing on a playground if you're simply out there playing a game of ball and nobody's getting hurt and there's no problems. She didn't care about every little detail, and it doesn't make any difference whether you hit the ball directly into center field or off into left field. Doesn't matter. Similarly, if there's a God in the universe, I would describe it this way. It's like we're all branches and leaves on a tree, and God would be the root. And the tree don't worry too much about where the leaves are blowing. It's not his part of the deal.
Yes, please.
Yes, you were telling this gentleman earlier on that he should make responsible decisions for other people in his life. At the same time, you were saying that everything that happens is God's will. In other words, the movie of his life has already been set by God. But by telling him that he can make a decision, isn't that the implication that the movie could change direction?
No, all it means is, quite frankly, you cannot not make a decision.
But the decision has already been made.
That's right. That is correct.
But then the whole thing is a joke.
It is a joke. Yes, you are quite right. The whole thing is a joke.
Oh, well, that's rather alarming, in fact.
You don't like jokes? You don't like jokes?
I mean, if a decision has to be made at the time the decision is being made, the experience is one of truly having a choice, but deep down it appears that there isn't a choice.
So, you're quite right. Deep down, you know that your decision is not going to make any difference to what is going to happen, what has already happened. But I repeat, that is not going to let you not make a decision. The energy inside this body-mind organism will continue to function. And if at the moment the energy is supposed to make a decision, a decision will be made. And the decision will be made according to the programming, which includes the environmental conditioning.
So you would say that decision occurs rather than I make a decision?
That is correct. Yes. That is exactly correct. A decision happens. But the ego thinks he is making a decision. Mm-hmm. That is quite correct. A decision happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. One brief...
Yes.
Maharaj used to tell people, be still. It's like, as if he was telling people, do this. For instance, be still. I mean, this is an impossible kind of suggestion, because at most I can keep my body still.
You see, just as I say, make a decision. If you want to make a decision, make a decision. And the basis of it being that apparently you are making a decision. Mm-hmm. So I'd say, make a decision. So Maharaj said, do it. The underlying principle being the doing of it by that body-mind organism will happen if it is supposed to happen. That doesn't prevent him from telling you, the individual, do it. The basic understanding is the doing of it will happen only if it is supposed to happen. But in talking, you have to use the active tense. Do it. But whether you will be able to do it or not in your control. Therefore, whether the doing of it will happen is entirely another matter. That doesn't prevent Maharaj from telling the reader, do it.
Okay, thank you.
But the underlying understanding is the doing may or may not happen according to the destinies. So what is the net result of this total acceptance that no one is a doer, neither he himself nor anyone else? The pleasure or the pain or the hurt happens and is accepted as the will of God and the destiny of that body-mind organism. But that acceptance will not be accompanied by a load of pride or guilt or hatred or jealousy. So the sage continues to live in samsara, participates in samsara or life as we know it, accepts the pleasures and the pains that are his lot according to God's will, that are his destiny, like anyone else. So the sage participates in samsara or life, accepts his share of the pains and pleasures, but without the enormous load of pride and arrogance, guilt or shame, or hatred or jealousy or envy. So my answer to the ego is, I am not promising you that life will not mean misery. Life may mean misery and happiness to the extent that it is your destiny. But those miseries and pleasures will not be accompanied. You will not be carrying the enormous load of pride and arrogance, guilt and shame, or hatred and jealousy. That is the advantage of this acceptance that no one is a doer. In other words, what I am telling the ego is, you will not only not die, but you will continue to live as long as the body-mind organism lives, but without the enormous load of pride and guilt and hatred. So, if that is acceptable, you may try. I still tell the ego, he has to do the trying. If you accept that what you are going to get is worth your effort, that the absence of this load is worth making an effort, then the ego says, all right, I am convinced. Now tell me, how do I get that understanding that I am not the doer? I am still dealing with the ego. So I tell the ego, very simple, I am not asking you, but remember this is my concept. I keep telling the ego too. Because the ego, otherwise the ego will bombard me every 3 minutes. How do I know it's the truth? So I keep telling the ego it's a concept. But a concept that could bring you an enormous amount of peace. So the ego says, what do I have to do? So I tell the ego, according to my concept, you don't have to meditate for 10 hours. Because if you meditate for 10 hours, then the danger is that you will consider yourself a more successful practitioner of seeking than someone else who is not able to meditate for 10 hours. Therefore, as your ability to meditate goes from 2 hours to 10 hours, your pride will also correspondingly increase. And the biggest obstacle to the happening of self-realization is pride and guilt. So, I'm not asking you to meditate for 10 hours a day. I'm not even going to ask you to meditate for 1 hour, because I'm telling the ego, you are entitled to ask me. Ramesh, you are asking me to meditate. All right, not 10 hours, but 2 hours. All right, 1 hour. But if I'm not able to meditate for 1 hour, what do I do? Valid argument. Therefore, I'm not asking the ego to either meditate or starve himself. I'm not asking him to go and do a lot of social work in the village, because then what will happen is all those villagers will treat you like God, and you will feel that you are God. That is the danger. Then the ego impatiently says, all right, what do you want me to do? So I said, all I want you to do is to find out from your own experience whether you have been the doer. What is your own experience? Forget my telling you, that's a concept. What is your own experience so far? Think of any action that you thought you did. If your friend asks you about it, how did you manage to do that tremendous achievement? Almost certainly you will begin to recollect that incident or that achievement. Almost certainly you will begin your statement by saying, at such and such a time, at such and such a place, it so happened. So, if your action, which you are so proud of, happened because something else happened, over which you had no control, how can you call it your action? So, from previous experience, investigate it. Investigate any action that has happened in your experience, and you will come to the conclusion that what you thought was your action depended on something else happening over which you have no control. Therefore, how can you call it your action? But that is past experience. More important, find out now, from actions happening now, today. So if you are busy during the day, all I tell the ego is, try and find 10, 20 minutes at the end of the day. Sit back quietly. Investigate, analyze, investigate thoroughly and honestly. Even one action during the day which you are convinced is your action. Find out, how did it happen? Did I decide to do it? Or was it that a thought came over which you had no control? Or you saw something over which you had no control? Or you heard something over which you had no control? Which led to that action. And every time, I would guarantee every ego that the ego will come to the conclusion that whatever he thought was his action turns out to be not his action, because he had no control over it. So day after day, action after action, if you come to the conclusion, I am telling the ego, that an action which you thought was your action turns out to be, on investigation, that it is not your action, then at some point you will ask yourself, if I am not the doer, if there is truly no me concerned in life that is happening through this body-mind organism, obviously the same thing must happen through others. In other words, the ego comes to the conclusion that life happens. No one lives his life. If life happens through every body-mind organism, is a me necessary? Is a me really necessary? And that question will be pure misery. That question to which the ego himself has arrived will not let him be. Every free moment, the question will arise. Who is this me? Is this me necessary? And that is what I call the dark night of the soul. I had a Buddhist monk visit me some few months ago. He has been a Buddhist monk for over 20 years. And we had a good talk for 3 days. And at one of these points when I mentioned this, I call it the dark night of the soul. He suddenly sat up and he says, in the Buddhist teaching also, in such circumstances, there is a specific word. He mentioned it, I forget the word. But he translated it. He was an Australian monk, so we were talking in English. And he said, the exact translation of the Buddhist word is horrors. You say dark night of the soul, and the Buddhist word is horrors. So the ego, when it reaches that stage, is there any me at all, suffers horrors. And depending on God's will and the destiny of that particular body-mind organism, if it is the will of God, then the answer comes from the source, not intellectually. Intellectually the answer was there. There is no me. Therefore this question, if there is no me doing anything, is there a me? So that question was not intellectual. That question was also from the source. And the answer, again, if it is the will of God, happens. And the answer from the source comes. My dear child, there never has been any me. All these me's are suffering unnecessarily. And that is because that is their destiny. You see? Let me repeat very briefly what I